Hello, Royal History Geeks. It's Gareth here, and we're back for another video, this time looking at the crucial question of, in the Wars of the Roses, who had the best claim to the throne? Was it the White Rose, the House of York, or the Red Rose, the House of Lancaster? Health warning. There's a big problem with the way that I've just phrased the question. If you tackle the question just as I just have phrased it, then actually there's a risk that you will miss understanding what the Wars of the Roses truly were and what caused them and what they were really about and what they were really trying to establish. However, the way that I've just phrased the question, York versus Lancaster, who had the better claim, is the way that you will often find the question phrased on social media. It's the way you might even find the question phrased down the pub, because this question has some currency in wider circles, and it's not just the real super cool royal history geeks like you and I that have pondered it. It is actually one that the mainstream population have some degree of knowledge around, or feel that they have some degree of knowledge around, and therefore it does come up, and therefore that's the way I phrased it, and that's a starting point, a launch pad, if you will, for us to begin our conversation today. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of background as to what the Wars of the Roses were, how they ended up, because I think if you didn't already know what the Wars of the Roses was, I don't think you'd have clicked on this video. And also, I'm doing some separate work on that at the moment. I'm writing some stuff on it, which I hope to put on the blog in due course, and will no doubt make other videos to delight us all. So I won't preempt that now. That's something to look forward to. So, to get a good place to start this conversation, we need to wind the clock back to 1460, and England has been in a pretty shoddy state for more than 10 years, but for the last 10 years people have been complaining about this. There have been people who have been sounding off about the way the country has been governed by Henry VI, who is the third king of the House of Lancaster, who's been on the throne since he was a baby, since 1422. And in 1460, the Duke of York, Richard, Duke of York, who has been the most vocal critic among the nobility about the reign of Henry VI, marches into the House of Lords, puts his hand on the throne, and declares that he is the rightful King of England and should be acknowledged as such by the assembled nobility. This is a pretty bold claim. Under what possible basis did Richard, Duke of York, have to say that he was the rightful King of England when the house that his cousin Henry VI came from, the House of Lancaster, had been on the throne since 1399, which is over 60 years. So we need to wind the clock back again a little bit further to the reign of the great king Edward III. Edward III was a very successful king. He reigned for 50 years and he died in 1377. He was a pretty old man by the standards of the day at that point, and he had 5 sons who lived to adulthood. His heir was his grandson, Richard II, because his son, who became known in history as the Black Prince, who was the Prince of Wales, had died, and Richard II, as he became, was therefore his heir. He, however, had in total 5 sons that lived to adulthood, and for reasons we won't go into now, Richard II didn't last very long on the throne. He didn't have any children, and when he was about 30, he was usurped by his cousin, who became Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster. Henry, who became Henry IV, was the son of the third son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, of Edward III. Richard, Duke of York, was the descendant of the fourth son, Edmund of Langley, of Edward III. So Henry VI, grandson of Henry IV. There's a lot of Henrys, so you have to bear with me on this one. So go back to 1460. Henry the Fourth, Henry the Sixth is the descendant of the third son of Edward the Third, and Richard, Duke of York, is the son, not the son, the descendant of the fourth son of Edward the Third. So you're like, well, case closed then. What is the Duke of York actually talking about? He descends from the fourth son, whereas the reigning king descends from the third son. You don't have to be great at maths or chronology to understand that he clearly has a weaker claim. However, there is a catch. Because as well as being a descendant on the male line of his family, Richard Duke of York, from Edmund of Langley, the fourth son of Edward the Third, through his mother, he is also a descendant of the second son of Edward the Third, Lionel of Antwerp. And Lionel of Antwerp, the second son, had a daughter, Philippa of Clarence, who had a son who is known to history as the Earl of March, because that was his title. And through a whole twist and turns, the heir general to that Earl of March was the Richard Duke of York's mother, and therefore Richard Duke of York becomes the heir to that line and to that title, and as such, arguably has a greater right to rule than the reigning Lancastrian family. So, this leads us into a slight problem, and it led the people of 1460 into a slight problem, because despite the fact that there'd been so many problems in the reign of Henry VI, particularly since the late 1440s, and frankly, anyone who had met Henry VI knew that he was incapable of governing. And this is not just he had made some errors of judgment, or he maybe wasn't quite cut up to the task of being a great military leader, which a medieval king was expected to be. Henry VI was fundamentally incapable of expressing any form of will or making any kind of decision. I don't want to get too far into this now because I think it's a subject for a whole other conversation. There's something I'm doing a lot of research about at the moment, but it is fairly clear that Henry VI, despite those new believing he had a kind and generous soul and nature, probably his whole life suffered from a debilitating form of mental illness, and we don't know what, that made him incapable of expressing any real sense of will or any real sense of purpose that was so fundamentally necessary for kingship. So despite all these problems staring the nobility in the face, York's claim that he was the rightful king, and York was a decent leader. He had problems. You wouldn't want to be friends with York. He wasn't a nice man, but he had some definite leadership skills. Despite all of that, the lords were a bit like, really, you've not mentioned this before, York. Kind of seems like the sort of thing that should have come up before now. If you really think you're the rightful king of England, you've been sitting on that for a long time, and I'm not quite sure what we do with it. And part of the reason, although by no means only, but part of the reason was it was not clear whether the crown could transcend through the female line. And yes, York descended from the second son of Edward III, whereas Henry VI only the third, but was succession through the female line valid? And this, of course, brings us on to a subject of huge debate. It is absolutely clear now, in 2020, that succession through the female line is valid. We have a female sovereign at the moment, and succession has constantly, in our history, transmitted down the female line. It was by no means as clear in 1460. And not only was it not clear in 1460? Really, the task that the legal minds and the nobility were concerned with was actually whether it would have been acceptable in 1399 when the House of Lancaster first came to sit upon the throne of England. The reality is that by the 1460s and certainly later, people were becoming more receptive to to succession through the female line. Frankly, there was little choice. Despite having 5 sons that lived to adulthood, there weren't actually very many male line descendants of Edward III left running around in the 1460s. The current king did have an heir to the throne, although he'd come on the scene relatively late in the day in 1453, which had given rise to some speculation as to who would become ruler of England should the king pass away without heir. And at that stage, people were talking about candidates who might come to the throne, would base their claim on female line descendants from Edward III. So one were the Hollands, who were descended by John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, through one of his daughters. Again, a female line claim. The other was Margaret Beaufort, who was descended from the male line from Edward III, albeit a questionably legitimate one, but was of course a woman herself, and therefore her descendants would have been claiming it through a female line. So it's certainly clear that by the sort of 1460s, right, people are certainly more open to it then. But that's not really the point, because rules of succession were changing all the time, and indeed they continued to throughout history. But I think it's a fairly well accepted principle that you can't therefore go back and apply those rules retrospectively. So, for example, it was relatively recently here, it was in the last 10 years, that the line of succession to the throne of the United Kingdom and to the other Commonwealth realms of which the Queen is head of state was changed, so that gender no longer made any difference as to who would inherit the crown. It was made clear by law that if the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, in today's Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, had a daughter first as their eldest child, that she would succeed to the throne irrespective of whether a little brother was born after her, which had not been the case a generation before. However, nobody argued that rule should be applied retrospectively, because of course even if we only went back as far as Queen Victoria and applied that rule, then the current queen would not be queen at all, because her great-grandfather, Edward VII, was the second child, eldest son, but second child of Queen Victoria, not the eldest child of Queen Victoria. So we wouldn't even have the current royal family if when we made these changes, we applied them retrospectively. So you can't just say that because probably by 1460 people were much more open to the idea of descent through the female line, that we can turn the clock back, because actually you have an established dynasty and you have a house that's on the throne, and that house is called the House of Lancaster. So the question is, when they seized the crown, there's no question really, although they tried to claim that they had a better claim than the incumbent Richard II. There are other reasons why Richard had to go. The question is, did they then have the best claim to the crown of England? And this is a question that's quite difficult to answer, but I'm going to argue that yes, they probably did have the best claim in 1399. Now, at this point, the Yorks were further down the line of succession, because the York claim and what people would later call the Mortimer claim, the second and therefore eldest son of Edward III had a daughter, Philippa of Clarence, who had married into the Mortimers. So the descendants and those that claimed the crown through Philippa of Clarence were the Mortimers, or the Earls of March, as their title was. And as a result, that claim to the throne is known by historians as the Mortimer claim. It would join with the House of York in the century after, but in 1399, the Mortimer claim was represented by the Earl of March. And Henry IV was a much stronger candidate for the throne in 1399 than the Earl of March, partly because the Earl of March was a child. And people didn't like child kings. Richard III had been a child king, and perhaps some people linked his failures as an adult to the fact that he'd been king as a child. People didn't like child kings, so the Earl of March wasn't a very desirable candidate. But also, in the late 1300s, there was a real trend toward female inheritance in general. Now, that's slightly odd because it had previously been accepted um, that the crown followed a similar pattern to common law, which is that if you have a son, your son gets the whole estate. So if I own 4 manors and I have, I'm known as the Lord of Kettering. I think if you were the Lord of Kettering, you'd have more than 4 manors, but bear with me because you'll see why now maths is quite important. And I have one son. My son will get the entire estate. However, if I have no son and I have one daughter, she will get the entire estate, although it will be under the control of her husband. However, if I have no son and 2 daughters, my 4 manors are going to get divvied up between the girls because girls do not take any precedence over each other in succession. So 2 manors are going to go to daughter 1 and 2 manors are going to go to daughter 2. That's how common law worked. Edward II, when making his will, had been very clear that the crown would follow the precedent of common law, so sons first, but if no sons, daughters, except elder daughter would take priority over younger daughters. So you wouldn't see England divvied up as if it were a personal fiefdom. And so it seemed that the crown was following a broad trajectory to the trajectory that York was wanting it to have followed in 1460 when he claimed the throne. However, Edward III, in just before he died, probably in 1377, seems to have left an entail in the form of a document. It was going to be a letter patent, which showed that the crown should not pass through females, but go through the male line only. So it first will go to his grandson, Richard II, but if Richard died without heirs, according to the will, not the will, but the will rather than the last will and testament of Edward III, it should pass to John of Gaunt, who is his third son, missing out the heirs of Philippa of Clarence, and then to the sons of John of Gaunt, and then to the other sons of Edward III. We don't fully know at what stage that document was. We don't know if it was fully adopted. We don't know how widely circulated it was. It would certainly have been known by some people. Crucially, it would have been known by John of Gaunt, which makes it highly unlikely. We know that because he witnesses it, I should say, which makes it highly unlikely that it wouldn't have been known by Henry IV, who was John of Gaunt's son. But we don't know exactly who knew about it. But in a sense, that doesn't matter. What matters more is it was probably representative of thinking toward the end of the 1300s. Basically, toward the end of the 1300s, it'd gone really out of fashion to allow any succession through the female line, and most of the major landowners in the country had arranged this form of legal trickery, basically, where they would basically surrender their whole estate to somebody else, and that, but someone who was clearly they trusted, who would then basically grant it back to them, to the original lord, in tail male. So it would only go through the male line. The reasons of this are pretty obvious. They didn't like the idea that their estates had been broken up by potential female inheritance. They particularly didn't like the thought that some, a medieval man on the make was going to marry one of their daughters, so get a bit of their estate if they didn't have any sons, and that their estate would effectively be divvied up and used to bolster the estates of new men on the way out. That was a repellent thought to them. So they were all trying to avoid female succession, and that seems to have caught on. So it's likely thinking was shifting. Actually, we expect things to always be constantly progressing to get more inclusive and toward equality, and that's certainly the way I suspect most of us would want to have seen it have gone. But the reality was, things were becoming more sexist at the end of the 1300s. So it's quite likely that attitude toward who should inherit the crown was following suit. And as such, in 1399, when Henry IV seizes the throne, he is probably seen, once you deal with the sort of niceties of the fact you've already got this alive king called Richard II, who's definitely got the best claim, once he's out of the way, Henry IV probably was seen to have the best claim. The Lancastrian claim would have been seen as superior to the Mortimer claim. So you get 1460 and it's not really working. York doesn't really get the support he wants because people are saying, yeah, I get it, York. But in 1399, that's not quite how it was. The Lancastrians are there now, and frankly, that's how it should be. You can't come and just turn the clock back with your claim. So to placate York, they're basically saying, okay, Henry VI stays where he is, but we'll disinherit his son, Edward Prince of Wales, and you can be king after that. It's a bit of a hollow promise to York because York's actually older. I think he's 8 years older than Henry VI. So that's not particularly helpful. And frankly, it's kind of already acknowledging the state of play. It does disinherit Edward the Prince of Wales, but there may well have been a huge doubt into people's minds as to whether he was legitimate. It's quite possible that if you knew Henry VI, you thought the chances of him siring a son were highly, highly, highly unlikely. So we don't know, but that's a possibility. And after them, York was probably the heir to the throne. Some would have favoured a Beaufort claim because they were closer to the House of Lancaster, but they were questioned. Their legitimacy was questionable, as many of you will know. So York was probably heir to the throne anyway. So it didn't really massively change things in York's favour, although, of course, the moving out of the way of the Prince of Wales was quite a big thing for York's descendants. Eventually, as many of you will know, the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, she doesn't accept this. She declares war. York dies. However, eventually, Richard's son Edward takes up his father's mantle and he becomes king. He does depose Henry VI, and he becomes king of the ruling House of York, Edward IV. What I would just say, by that time, that probably was the best thing that could have happened. So if you go back to the question of York versus Lancaster, this is where it's tricky. Lancaster probably, in any meaningful sense, had a better claim to the throne because they were the established dynasty. But it probably was right at this stage, when everything else had fallen apart, that Henry VI had to go and that Edward IV becomes king, the first king of the House of York. What I think we should be very clear on, however, is that almost nobody, probably nobody, was fighting for Edward IV because they believed his claim, the Mortimer claim, was stronger. The reality is most people weren't that bothered about the ins and outs of the Constitution and who had the best legal right to be king. People probably had a broad affinity to three principles. One, and this was so important, was anointing. If you were an anointed king, God had put you on the throne, and really no man should be pushing you away. They also had an affinity to a house, to a dynasty, and an established dynasty. And fundamentally, particularly as you get into the gentry class, they cared about the country being successfully run and order prevailing so that they could get on and do what they had to do. Henry VI was an anointed king. And we see that in 1460 when York states his claim. Despite everything that's gone wrong, the lords are so resistant about doing away with an anointed king. The House of Lancaster was established. So regardless of the Mortimer claim, when they did look beyond Henry VI, it wasn't clear that they would like any solution that wasn't Lancastrian. Arguably the Hollands, arguably Margaret Beaufort would have a better claim because they were closer to John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. However, on the flip side, they would have liked the fact that York was a Plantagenet and it maintained the Plantagenet line. Where Henry VI really fell down was his ability to actually govern. And I think that's what threw the gentry so decisively behind Edward IV. If it was about the nobility never really deserted Lancaster, it's only conceivable Edward IV won the throne because the gentry abandoned Henry VI and went hook, line and sinker for the House of York. And I think they did that, and I think historians are now shedding a lot of light on this, not because they cared two hoots about the Mortimer claim, but because at this stage it had become obvious to the gentry that Henry VI was not running England. The nobility had always known that, but it was becoming more obvious to everyone else that Margaret of Anjou was really the standard bearer for the Lancastrian cause. She was acting like a duke. She was basing her campaign and her military operation out of her lands, out of Lancastrian lands. She was acting like a baron and not like a king. And of course, people didn't want to be ruled over by a French woman. They were xenophobic. They were sexist. We don't like it, but it's true. And therefore, for them, their chances were a prince of the blood of the line of the Plantagenet line, House of York, not House of Lancaster, but hey, we know what this is, it's an Englishman, or a French woman. And more than anything, they wanted to see order restored. It was only when they effectively felt Henry VI's kingship was abdicated in all but name that they were prepared to really put their muscle behind the House of York. And that is what won the throne for York, nothing whatsoever to do with the Mortimer claim. It's been another long video. I've spoken a lot. I hope you've enjoyed it. Leave me some comments. Tell me if you agree. Tell me if you disagree. And let's talk again soon. Thank you. Stay safe and stay well.